We don't need no sticky stand.
Yes, I am a gentleman. Hi. Hi. Making sure what is my range I can move here. I don't know, I can't stand still. I can't just do the hi, my name is Paul. I can't stand still. Okay, today first. This actually, I put this story in the category of wacky stuff. And fortunately, lots of wacky stuff happens to me in my life. And it makes my life more interesting and more fun. I'll call this story the day that the gods kicked in the door and didn't leave. And this is wacky stuff. This happened around 2001, around the same time as Captain Snickersbar, Mr. Snickersbar. Okay. This was, there's a good friend of mine whom I'm going to call Tony, to keep his identity. He just doesn't know I'm telling the story, so we'll call him Tony. Tony was like one of the first guys I met when I came to Japan in 1995. We kind of knew each other. We were in the same sort of circle of people. And then he moved away. He was overseas, and he came back to Japan, and by a whole bunch of coincidence, he ended up living just across the hall from me. Around this time, I had learned this thing called Reiki, which is actually this sort of energy healing thing, new agey kind of thing. It actually originally comes from Mount Kurama in Kyoto. Anyway, I went to America, and this woman says, "Hey, I learned this thing. I'm going to teach you how to do it. Actually, just sit down in the chair." She taught me in like 5 minutes. All right, just the opening up the channels, whatever. So my friend, we start chatting, we're talking, and I was explaining this to him, and he's like, "Well, why don't you do this sort of Reiki treatment on me?" I was like, "Okay." Didn't know that much about it, so it was, Japanese, so we do it on the floor. He's laying flat on the floor, and I start off by putting hands on the different chakras, the energy centers. And as I put my hands on his head, he didn't really believe so much of this stuff, all right? He's just like, well, okay, just try it. And so I put my hands on his head, and he goes, "Wow, that's really weird." He goes, "Once you started doing this, there's this like, all these strange images just flashing in my head." And he starts explaining the images to me. He explains he sees a giant naval battle in the sea, and he thought it was like the Japanese against the Americans of World War II, but he wasn't quite sure. And then he sees a bunch of doughboys in the First World War going over trench and getting mowed down by machine gun fire, and he sees, not all these are very pleasant things, right? He goes, "I don't know what these are about." And he explained a whole bunch of different ones. And they felt really familiar to me. I was like, I didn't know why, but they did. Anyway, so we're keeping talking. We're going on about this, and he's telling me these stories, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty weird. So I put my hands over his throat chakra, and then I get to this heart chakra. I put my hand on his heart. And suddenly, there's a jolt in his body. And a voice comes out of his mouth and says, "Tony, just relax." And then Tony goes, "That wasn't me, that wasn't me, that wasn't me, that wasn't me, that wasn't me." It's like, and the voice comes out again. I mean, it was his voice that came out of his throat, but it wasn't the same voice that came out of his mouth. I like the look on your face. Yeah, this is not BS, it's true, it really actually happened. So this voice comes out of his mouth again and says, "Just relax, Tony. Just breathe deeply." And Tony, at this point, his heart's going, because that wasn't me, that wasn't me, that wasn't me. And then this voice starts telling me something, gave a message to me, which I'm not going to share to you because it's personal, but it was basically kicking me in this side for something stupid that I was going to be doing, I was thinking of doing, da-da-da-da-da. What it turns out to be, as I learned later, you may not believe this stuff, and I didn't used to believe in this stuff until all this weird stuff started happening in my life. This was my spirit guide who had entered his body to give me this message so that I wouldn't do something exceptionally stupid in my life. And then, okay, so this voice is telling me what it needed to do, and then it left. And I could feel another jolt in his body. And then Tony sits up and he goes, that was really weird, that was really weird, that wasn't me. And then we talked a little bit more. And then Tony was like, wait a minute, something really strange is going on. And then Tony was thinking that there's like 100 voices in his head, all wanting to talk to us at the same time. He goes, this is really strange. And the voice that came out of his mouth came in his mind and said, make a long story short, this is like my spirit guide was going, okay, everybody shut up. So, everybody shut up, shut up, shut up. One speak at a time. And I don't know if you believe it this way, but these spirits started speaking through Tony. And he's like, this is really strange. And the spirits weren't always very happy with us. Actually, the people that were talking to me were doing a lot of this. What are you doing this for? You should be doing that. So, this is kind of wacky, right? Make a long story short, these spirits, if you believe it or not, or these, schizophrenic experience, the only thing is the schizophrenic experience is usually not with two people at the same time, started to give us instructions on how to do things to improve our lives. And they gave us very specific things like, why don't you go to the bookstore and look for a book that's green? And then we get this book that's green, and it tells us specifically what to do that we could help us, in certain parts of our lives. Anyway, this was a very good experience for me, because I learned how to let go through this experience working with this guy and with these guides that would talk to us, how to let go of a whole bunch of junk that I had been carrying around in my life. I used to be a drunk and using drugs all the time, and I had a whole bunch of anger and in my insides, and I let it out. So anyway, this is a pretty wacky thing, but yeah, so that's my first story of having experiences. The world is actually a much more amazing place than it appears in the front when you're just looking at stuff. There is stuff in the universe that isn't so rational. I mean, I think the world is actually magical, it's not rational. I mean, how many people do you know, for example, that are rational, right? Most human beings that I've met aren't rational. It doesn't mean that they're bad, it's just that, things are pretty amazing. Anyway, I'm going to stop right there with this story. So, thank you very much for listening.